Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to One Idea Away. As you know, connection is a core theme that we regularly explore here on the show. And it's something that I think you've heard in our past many episodes at this point, that connection is literally, it's something that's hardwired into who we are as human beings. And as we've explored any number of topics, including a bit from neuroscience and psychology, we're learning more and more about literally how are we wired, meaning the way in which we work as human beings, but we're also hearing about the fundamental importance of connection to our overall well-being. And I don't just mean our physical well-being, I mean emotional and mental and spiritual well-being. It just has huge implications for the way that we get a sense of meaning, the satisfaction we have in life. It's got tons of those ramifications. And I'll be honest, this is not something that I just explore from the professional side of things. I am an individual that really loves diving into the field of connection, but where this stems from for me is that it stems from being a parent, from being a father of both a daughter as well as a son. And I'm very, very attuned to the way in which disconnection creeps into us from a very, very early age. And I want something different for them. I know the journey that I've traveled, and it was not always one that was very easy. It's one that certainly had me move away from that sense of connection and that rich inner life and bringing that inner life out into the world. That's something I shut down for many, many years. And I would love to continue to explore ways that our future generations, and very selfishly my kids, don't run into that trap and instead open up, and hopefully many people open up, that creates a totally different level of connection throughout all of society, throughout our communities. And let's just see where that can go. And so today I want to advance this conversation with really, truly just a pioneer in the field, somebody who's doing extraordinary work that I wanted to introduce you to. We're going to take the tack of looking at the whole of human connection and the way that this impacts us. And we'll probably get into a little bit of how this affects our boys and our girls, even us at home in different ways. And so with that, let me introduce you to Niobe Way. Niobe is a professor of developmental psychology and the founder of the Project for the Advancement of Our Common Humanity at New York University. You can also find them at pach.org. One of the excerpts just from the Project for Advancement of Our Community, Common Humanity, I wanted to read to you, is that this is a think and do tank that draws from the science of human connection in order to create a just and humane world. Our theory of change is that transforming the way that we see each other will transform the way we treat each other. We're going to explore that a bit today. Specifically, Dr. Way's work focuses on the intersections of culture, context, and human development, with a particular focus on social and emotional development and how cultural ideologies influence developmental trajectories. Dr. Way has authored nearly 100 journal articles and books, including her most recent co-authored book, The Crisis of Connection, which is what originally put Niobe on my radar. And so with that, Dr. Way, Niobe, thank you so much for being here on One Idea Away.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
Excellent. This issue, this crisis of connection is something that we've explored in just a whole host of different ways on this show. But I guess I'm curious for you of what led you to this work. I'm always interested to hear a bit about the journey that leads people to these wonderful discoveries and work that they're bringing into the world.
Yeah. So it actually, it's interesting because it comes from my professional work, but really it starts from a very personal story. I grew up in Oberlin, Ohio, which is considered a very liberal town in the Midwest. I went to elementary, middle school, high school there. And the community that I was raised in was a very supportive one, but it had a lot of divisions in it. And this is, we're talking about in the 70s. Racial divisions and class divisions. So there was the classic sort of towny kids versus the kids of the faculty. That was what I see as a class division, and also a sort of university, non-university division. Mm-hmm. Then there was certainly division between white and black students. My high school was about 50% black, 50% white. There were those divisions. And I've been fascinated since I was a little girl about why those divisions happen and why there can't be a conversation across divisions and relationships and community building across divisions, not just within our own group. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up going to college. I ended up deciding I wanted to get my PhD in counseling, to be a counselor for youth, because I wanted to help that sort of repair those divisive relationships. I realized when I was a counselor in a high school, and this is in Boston, this is in the late 80s, I started to counsel high school kids. And I thought when I would counsel boys, for example, I would hear a lot about their struggles with their girlfriends or their struggles with their parents, or their struggles with their teachers. These were kids, low-income kids, primarily, and kids of color. What I really heard is an enormous number of story about friendships and wanting to have friends and wanting to have closer friends and feeling hurt by the betrayal of friends. And I heard this from the young women and young men, but I really heard it from a lot of the young men who I was counseling. And it all of a sudden occurred to me when I was sort of hearing these stories about friendships all the time, that my brothers, I have two brothers, who had been struggling with friendships themselves. One is younger, one is older. Actually, sorry, both of them are younger, sorry. Both of them are younger brothers. They had struggled with their own friendships. And so the idea is, I realized it wasn't just these boys who I was counseling, it was actually the brothers in my family. And then I became obsessed, really. I switched into a PhD program focused on human development. I figured, what's going on that we're not telling this story about friendships? We're not telling, friendships is not part of our, so-called protective factors for human development. We look at things like mental health. We look at things that like, parent relationships. We look at things like, nutrition, all sorts of good things that are all positive things, of course, or can be positive, obviously. But we weren't really looking at friendships. We were looking at peer relationships, but that was like negative peer influence. So how peers get you to do bad things. We weren't looking at these amazing things we can have in our lives, which are close friendships. And we weren't taking them seriously. So when I first started looking at researching friendships, I would get these comments. Oh, that's really sweet. That's your topic? Oh, that's really sweet. And I thought, how interesting that we even see it in a sort of condescending way. What I realized in realizing the connection between not only with the kids and my brothers is that I wanted to investigate this. So people would say, that's very sweet, which means it's a condescending sort of notion of these friendships that are like, it's sweet, but it's not really serious science. It's not really a serious topic. And so I began to decide, I began to focus on essentially listening to what young people could teach us about friendships, boys in particular, because they had been totally left out of the conversation regarding close friendships. In fact, so much left out that we assumed that they didn't want them as much as girls. And that in fact, they didn't desire emotional intimacy as much as girls. And that stereotype remains today, by the way. Yeah. So the point is, I began to listen to young boys and follow them through adolescence. And I began to realize not only do boys sometimes have and certainly want this kind of close relationships with other boys, but that they faced a crisis of connection as they got older, where the pressures to man up blocked their ability to find the relationships they want. And then from that, that was just sort of an amazing story that I was hearing from hundreds and hundreds of boys from all different walks of life, all different social classes, races, and even we do some work in China as well, even in China. And then I began to realize, oh my goodness, it's a larger story. It's a larger story about not only boys' crisis of connection that they face as they grow up, but all of our crisis of connection that as we grow up, as someone says in The Breakfast Club, John Hughes movie, The Breakfast Club, one of the characters says, when you grow up, your heart dies. And I thought, that just summarizes how we define maturity, how we define being an adult, is basically not being vulnerable, especially obviously for men, but I think women are deeply shaped by this as well. Being emotionally stoic, not needing others, being fully self-sufficient, all those kinds of things, which are positive things. This is not a critique of those qualities, but it's to the exclusion of all those things we need, the relational, the empathy to have relationships, the sensitivity and vulnerability to become close to someone. And that story of not only the human desire for it and the fact that many young men and girls and boys were having those relationships, but that as we grow up, especially in American culture, and I can talk about why I think it's particularly in American culture, we grow up into someone who is oftentimes, particularly for men, but I think women experience this too, these sort of isolated, lonely, disconnected people, because we've been told all our life that that's the meaning of maturity. That's incredible to me, that maturity is linked to essentially hyper masculinity. And I think and then it creates a crisis of connection for us all. And we see evidence, as everybody knows right now, tremendous evidence for a crisis of connection that's seen in loneliness, a rise in loneliness, rise in suicide, rise in mass violence, rise in drug addiction, all sorts of things that are linked to isolation and loneliness. So the story just, I learned it originally from listening to young people and young boys in particular, but also girls as well. And then it became a huge story that I began to realize this is a cultural story and everybody's experiencing it.
Yeah, I think the research that has been coming out in the way of loneliness and depression and violence and suicide has been rather staggering to see. And it's been ever increasing at really incredible rates in even just the last couple decades.
That's right.
I think part of what you're highlighting, and I think this is what really was an interesting, I've heard this in different ways, but it was something very interesting to see you position it this way, especially given the science of it, is that it seems like for a long time, because of the labels and the categorizations of being a man or a woman, masculine, feminine, whatever other labels we want to start throwing out, it seems that we've moved away from the wholeness of our humanity. And that we're just these fragmented beings. And so naturally, if we feel that way, whether we're conscious of it or not, we're going to feel that as we get older, and it's going to feel like literally something is missing. The number of times that I've heard phrases like that from clients of mine across different ages is unbelievable. It's staggering.
Yeah.
And I guess
it's I just have to add something to that. So
please.
This is something really super interesting. So if you boil it down, what we have done as a culture, and a culture at the moment, I'm talking about American culture, but guess what? We export all these qualities, unfortunately. We export some good qualities too, but we export these qualities too, which is that we've taken core human capacities, which is thinking and feeling, and we've given it a gender. That's extraordinary. So we think thinking is more masculine and feeling is more feminine. We've even raced it. We've even classed it. And those we consider sort of what I call on the top of the hierarchy of humanness. That is the system which we live under, unfortunately, are given those sort of more masculine qualities, and those we consider on the bottom of the hierarchy are given the more feminine qualities. But the point is that those aren't masculine and feminine qualities; those are human qualities. I mean, thinking and feeling, we all know we think and feel. We know the neuroscience says you can't feel without thinking, and you can't think without feeling. I mean, they're integrated together. So the idea that we are a culture that has literally given a gender to core human capacities is fundamentally the root of the problem. And then not only we've given a gender, we've put it in a hierarchy so that thinking is above feeling. So if we value both thinking and feeling, you could say, okay, then should be both stereotypically masculine and feminine. No. The problem is that we put one on top of the other. So you're not supposed to be emotional in order to be a man. You're not supposed to be vulnerable in order to be a man. And that sort of demeaning and mocking of the feminine, and this is the part that's very hard for some people to hear, that is at the root of our problems. It's not just that we need to reimagine masculinity. That's too easy. What we need to do is actually value what we have stereotyped as so-called girly and gay. And that I'm going to say something that sounds amusing to people, but being stereotypically girly and gay is at the root of our humanity. So, I mean, that really is. It's about being sensitive and emotional and vulnerable and open and wanting relationships and starving for relationships. And what I've discovered from listening to now boys and men, girls and women, non-gender binary conforming people now for decades, it's now going into my 4th decade of this work, is that people are fundamentally starving for relationships. They are starving to find deep connection. The more we treat them as if they're just superficial things that you just need a lot of friends, not deep friends. So you need a lot of Facebook friends rather than one deep friend, the more we get ourselves into trouble. So if you look at even the friendship apps that are now out there, which is interesting, there's a growing number of friendship apps. What's interesting to me is so many of the apps are focused on gaining more friends, so expanding your network of friends rather than deepening your existing friendships, which is exactly what the boys say they want. They don't want more friends. They want a friend who they can be vulnerable with and expressive, and obviously girls and women and non-gender binary folks say the same thing. So,
Right.
so the idea is that we have gendered something that's fundamentally human. And if you look across the 20th century, by the way, and I have to throw this out, Luke, you see early cultural anthropologists like Margaret Mead talking about how gender is arbitrary. We've given arbitrary qualities to gender, and then we force people into those categories, and that damages our humanity. So my message that I learned from the boys, we have been saying this in our culture, especially coming from young people, for over a century. Yeah. We have known this for over a century. And Luke, the shocking thing is that young people have been saying to the grown-ups for over a century, like Holden Caulfield and Catcher in the Rye, yes, what is wrong with you people? What is wrong with you people? Why can't you listen to what we're saying, what you want? You want this too. And yet you insist on, from Holden Caulfield, phony relationships, right? I mean, if any of your listeners remember that novel, you hear it throughout the 20th century, and you hear it in the research. And young people are saying, what is wrong with you? Why are you not paying attention to what we all need?
There's so a few things that you hit on that I just kind of want to pull out a little bit further. Right where you ended, I mean, this idea of the number of people that I hear and recognize is basically standing up right now and just doing everything they can to say, see me.
Yeah.
Please just see me, as opposed to, which is, I think, the other aspect of this that you're highlighting. And I'm curious of how this sits with you. It seems that at the heart of it, when you talk about the categorization and the way in which we value these categories and this arbitrary hierarchy and separation that we've created, so much of that seems that there's a fundamental judgment, even a fundamental prejudice in the way in which we are approaching so much of this. And that's what we're really, I mean, how many issues today should we be breaking apart based off of the fact that they are biased? They're based on prejudice.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, if you create a hierarchy and you put certain people and the stereotypic qualities on one side of the hierarchy and stereotypic qualities that are all just human qualities on the bottom, you're going to have a problem. Because what's going to happen is that if you don't value those qualities on the bottom, you're going to create stereotypes that they're lame, right? So that all you need to say is that we still have a culture that when we say, don't be such a girl, that's an insult. The fact that don't be such a girl, that's half our humanity, is an insult. It just tells the story that the boys have been telling us. There's a problem with that. We think don't be such a girl is an insult. We would never say, I mean, in certain circles, we might say don't be such a boy because we can stereotype negatively boys too, of course. But the point is that don't be such a girl is basically don't be so lame. Don't be so weak. Don't be so vulnerable. Don't be so whatever it is. So the point is that there's a way in which our stereotypes, I mean, it's not a way or which, it is. Our stereotypes reinforce that hierarchy and then make it impossible for us to connect. And I have to say, and I'm going to pick on a piece of work that was very popular in the 90s, I think. What was it? Men were from Mars and women are from Venus. Mm-hmm. That mentality has done great damage to our culture. That has done massive damage to our culture. Because as long as we take what is cultural and turn it into nature, we're in trouble, right? And that's what we've done for over a century. We take what we find in American culture in particular, and certainly Western culture, but definitely American culture, and we make it into nature. And then we say, hey, it's just natural. It's just natural that, boys and men are jerks. It's just natural that, girls can't control their emotions. I mean, whatever slam we want to say. But the point is that is deeply damaging because none of this is natural. We know from the baby research, we know this. I'm a developmental psychologist. I know this intimately. I teach this stuff. When babies are born, they are remarkably empathic, sensitive, tuning into people's emotions, reading the emotional world, seeing if the person who's partnering with them, whether it's their mother, their father, their brother, their sister, is matching their emotions. And when their emotions aren't matched, this is at 5 months old, when their emotions aren't matched by the person who's engaged with them, they start to scream out because they want the emotion to be matched. So when they're showing joy and you're showing like you're not really paying attention and not being joyful with them, they get distressed. When they're showing anger and you come back with with, not anger or not sort of taking their anger seriously, they get distressed. I mean, the point is that we are unbelievable social animals that can read emotion in such incredible ways. I mean, I always think it's amazing that I can hear someone on the phone, and even by the way they're breathing, can pick up their emotion. So when they catch their breath, I know they're a little bit nervous. When they, that I can read that. I'm incredibly good at it, and so is everybody. And then we grow up thinking that somehow those skills are somehow with one gender or with one social class or whatever it is. And the point is, it's problematic. Now, I have to say to all my doubters, because I do get doubters sometimes, well, the research on adults show that there is gender differences in empathy. So this is my response always. It's adults.
Yeah.
If you grow up in a culture that says being emotionally astute is lame and it's only what girls are doing, guess what? You're going to learn to be less sensitive because you're being told that it's lame.
It's self-fulfilling.
It's self-fulfilling. Absolutely. And I'm not, social neuroscientists say this. They say, it's learned. It's learned. It's learned. You learn essentially as a boy or a man, or unfortunately, I think increasingly girls as well now, because it's a very masculine culture we live in, is to grow up and be less sensitive. When you grow up, your heart dies. I mean, that was a movie made, I think, in the early 90s. John Hughes at the time, at least, was picking up on this sort of sense of when you grow up, your heart dies. Oh my goodness. Yeah. That's the culture we live in.
And I think the part of what we're also now seeing, which is also part of the hopefulness of what we're starting to see as well, is that the work around vulnerability, around compassion, around empathy, around these types of fields, they're not only, it's not just what the science is showing, but look at the way that people are clamoring for those books and those courses and those weekends and everything else, because we're thirsting for it after all this time. The one piece I want to throw in there, though, because I'm curious also about this. I love the emphasis of how we've taken culture and made it nature. And if we learn nothing else from nature, it's that nature will always seek to harmonize. It wants to move back into that harmony. And so much of what we're describing, it's not so many of the traits you're describing. It's not that the traits themselves are bad. It's that they're out of harmony. They're out of balance.
Yeah. And
that's what,
absolutely. I mean, it's a little bit like the Chinese yin and yang. I mean, the idea is that you can't just live with the yin and you can't just live with the yang. And it's the same idea. And we somehow think we create these divisions and we put them in a hierarchy. And then we think we can live with one or the other. We can live with the mind or the heart, not the mind and the heart. And that, when you say it like that, Luke, everybody agrees with you, because how can you disagree with what I'm saying? There's nothing to disagree with. I mean, obviously you need the mind and the heart. I mean, obviously that's what makes us human. And I just think it's interesting to me, because when my book came out, Deep Secrets, in 2011, on boys, I expected there to be a reaction. I never expected the reaction I got. I never expected that, 9 years later now, that I still get probably almost on a weekly basis, media calling me to do an interview, to talk about the finding. It remains, that body of work remains still one of the very few pieces of work that shows not just that boys are suffering, because a lot of books show that boys are suffering. But this is the thing in terms of your optimism stuff. It shows the solution, because what boys sound like at 13, 14, and 15 reveals the solution, which is simply, this is the solution. I'm going to say it bluntly to your listeners. Nurture the natural capacity to connect. That's all you got to do as parents, as teachers, as lovers, as friends, as partners. I mean, nurture that natural capacity to connect, because we have it as a natural capacity. And that is such an important thing to say. I am not communicating a sad story. I mean, it is a sad story, but it's not a depressing story.
It's only part of a story,
It's a part of a story that says, if we don't nurture that, as the boys said directly, we go crazy, right? If as a culture we don't nurture the human capacity to connect deeply with another human, then we go crazy. And we are, Luke, we are going crazy. We're going crazy with mass violence, with, even our president, unfortunately. I mean, we are in a state of pure craziness. And that's Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and I think that's something that, and I'd love for you to just speak a little bit to this, because I think it was one of the things that was, again, you sense, but it was alarming to actually kind of hear and see,
Yeah,
was the way in which we look at the world differently when we're isolated.
yeah, yeah,
Right. And it just,
yeah,
and if you could just share a little of that, because to me,
yeah,
it was alarming how
yeah,
once the separation occurs,
yeah,
it's a total different
yeah,
trajectory it sends
yeah.
you on.
Well, this is the thing, and I want to throw in, if I can talk about this, because I actually hope you'll squeeze this in, because I think it's
Sure.
important. So a lot of people have said, because there's been so much mass violence happening lately,
Yeah.
why is it linked to hate groups? Why is there a rise in hate crime? And essentially, if you isolate someone, we know this from the research. This is not just, and I really want to remind your listeners, everything I say is based on knowing the research, either my own research or the
Yeah.
huge body of research supporting this.
Yes.
If you isolate people, if you isolate them, they are going to, like all animals, social animals, seek connection wherever they can get connection.
Yes.
So we already know for low income urban communities, oftentimes young men can seek gangs, right, to try to find connection. Now, yes, it's not a healthy form of connection because it involves violence oftentimes and all sorts of things. And white men and white young men are doing the same thing. They are isolated young men, these mass violence perpetrators. They are seeking connection wherever they can find it. And oftentimes what they find it is in white nationalism. So they find other men who are equally isolated and lonely and angry, right? Because they feel excluded from the conversation. They feel excluded from other people's love.
Yeah.
I'm not saying, this is not a let's feel sorry for them. I'm just saying, I'm not doing that. What I'm saying is that if as a culture we don't provide healthy forms of connection for everybody, right? With the decline of religion, there's fewer and fewer communities where you're bonding, in a healthy way. Young people are going to find it where they can find it. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be in hate groups. It's going to be in all sorts of very, very damaging things that they join. And you hear it, if you listen to the narratives of people who commit mass violence, it's amazing. Yeah. The boy a young man, 2014, Elliot Rogers at UC Santa Barbara, the night before he killed, I think, 7 people, he said into the video camera, he said, "Tomorrow I will kill all of you, humanity." And he points at the camera exactly like this. And he says, "Who's let me rot in my own loneliness." And every time you listen to another perpetrator who has posted the Boston Marathon boy, the brothers, mm-hmm. listen to any of those boys and young men, they're telling you the same message. So then the question is, why are they so lonely? What's made them so isolated? Because we live in a culture that we don't think relationships should be the definition, of healthy human development. I mean, our notions of maturity should be this, Luke. Yeah. Maturity should be simply the ability and capacity to have healthy, mutually connected relationships. Yeah. That's it. And we should nurture that human capacity to do that. And then we won't get kids that are super lonely and then eventually go crazy.
Well, I appreciate you breaking it down this way, because I think when we do approach really difficult issues, but we can approach them from a standpoint of what I would refer to as systems thinking, meaning looking at the whole of how are all of these different parts connected, as opposed to just the end result of where things are. Exactly. It's incredibly important. And at the root of where some of that began is, for everybody listening, we all have certain human needs or drivers, and I'll discuss it from a standpoint of needs. We're going to meet those needs in either a healthy or an unhealthy manner, but the need is going to get met. Yeah. Yeah. And that's what you're talking about, is that we've unfortunately, we've got a system and a culture that, because we're not addressing this as head on and as directly as we could and nurturing the things we should, people are left to their own devices, and they're going to find it wherever they can.
And they can, and that's also, remind yourself that that's also a positive thing.
Yes.
Right? We actually know how to solve our own problems, even though, of course, when you join a hate group, you're not really solving your problem. Yeah. Right? We know how we have the natural instinct to actually try and connect, because that's a human thing. And this is the other thing that I think I really want your listeners to hear, which is that we have what we've learned from the research and from the boys and from listening to girls and all the social neuroscience research and evolutionary anthropology and biology and primatology, is that we have it within ourselves to solve our own problems, which is our natural capacity to connect to each other. That means the solution lies within ourselves. So it's literally recognizing that we have within ourselves the capacity to change the culture. And for all those naysayers that tell me changing the culture is really hard, excuse me, I don't think so. We change the culture almost weekly. We have legalized gay marriage that happened for someone my age overnight, essentially. The fight for legalized gay marriage. We have the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. We have all sorts of things happening. We had a Black president for 8 years. I mean, and then we moved to Trump. It's a very different world. So my point is that we change the culture all the time. And I think it's important, Luke, I'm really appreciative that you said that. And we are doing now all sorts of things related to my Think and Do tank as well,
yes.
which is trying to bring all the positive work together that's happening across the world and definitely in the United States to try to deal with this crisis of connection. We have gotten an enormous response from our book, The Crisis of Connection. We have whole school systems, we have whole universities, we have all sorts of organizations that are recognizing the crisis of connection, and they turn to us and they're saying, what do we do? And the very first thing I say, what do we do collectively in your school, in your home, as a parent, whatever position you're playing, or you have rather, is to basically recognize that you have to normalize these human capacities and not say they're a girly thing, they're a boy thing, they're just say they're a human capacity and need, and that we need them to thrive. And our species has thrived, according to Charles Darwin, because of our social capacities. He literally says that we wouldn't have thrived as a species without our social capacity. Sarah Hrdy, a beautiful evolutionary anthropologist at UC Berkeley, says, we've told the story of our evolution as hunter and gatherers. Why have we never told it as the people who raise their children? If we had never raised children, right, we would never survive. Why isn't the story of our evolutionary past about raising children?
Yeah.
And what she calls alloparenting, fathers, mothers, uncles, big brothers, big sisters raising each other.
Yes.
Right? And the whole idea is, she said, it's amazing that the process of raising children has been left out of our evolutionary stories. And so if you start normalizing that we are relational animals, we thrive in relationships, we are born in relationship, we definitely have a sense of self, and we want to nurture that sense of independence and autonomy, that we have the capacity to say no and to have agency, but it's within relationships. It's not separated from relationships. Yeah. So this is not a rejection of the independence, and it's not a critique of autonomy. It's saying that we are naturally needing both to be autonomous and to be self-sufficient and have agency, and at the same time embedded in healthy, mutually supportive relationships, and then we thrive. And we know that. We already know that, Luke. Yeah. This is not, the boys teach us something we already know, but we're not acting on it enough.
I love the context of putting this idea of raising our children, raising our families back into the story of evolution for us. Because I think it is so wonderful to it's so true. That rings you so true for me hearing that.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, and I guess I'm curious for you and some of the work maybe that you're also doing today, part of this to me is also generationally, us as parents, us as we get older as adults, we've got to take some ownership of how we're showing up in the world. And that revolves around a degree of awareness, a degree of mindfulness, and building our own social emotional capacities.
Yeah.
Because we are part of the stats that say, oh, when they're older adults, they go this way.
Yeah.
We have to be part of that, not just in the next generation, but where do they learn?
Yeah.
They learn from watching us.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think, I'm now speaking to parents directly, because I'm a mother of two teenagers, a boy and a young man and a young woman. That whole sense of the stories we tell our children about who they are and who we are have to shift. So the stories of, for example, when something happens, like a bully happens at school, both my kids were bullied when they were younger, talking about why at the dinner table, why he's bullying. Not as a way to, let's say, feel sympathy for him, but understand that we're actually not born bullies. We're not born mass murderers. We're not born rapists. We become rapists, some of us. So what happened? Why is this kid bullying? So at the dinner table with my kids, I realized the importance of them understanding that bullying almost always comes from loneliness, and the attempt to try to get people to pay attention to him or her through bullying, through acts of bullying. We would have conversation about what's happening in the newspaper, and again, linking things like, obviously when they got older, rape, murder, drug addiction, all sorts of things, to why do you think people do those kinds of things that are against their own humanity? Yeah. Why do they kill themselves? Why do they hurt themselves? Why do they hurt other people? How could they hurt people? How could a boy go in and kill 25 children in a school? Yeah. And the whole idea is to get them to see that all of these problems are not 15 different problems, they're one problem. They're a deep disconnection to the self and not seeing your own humanity. And if you don't see your own humanity, you cannot see the humanity of other people. You cannot do it. And the reason I can see the humanity of a lot of people, and you can as well, is I promise you, Luke, I know nothing about you, but that somehow your humanity has been seen by lots of people in your life. Yes. So you can see your own humanity. And then it's easy for me to see people's humanity, regardless of difference, because I have been nourished so thoroughly in my own humanity. So I know I'm human, and I know I'm vulnerable, and I don't have a problem crying in front of my huge class at NYU when I'm feeling, I don't sob, but I don't have a problem, getting teary-eyed or something, because I'm not threatened by it, because I know that the students will interpret it exactly the way I mean it, which is that I feel too. I'm not just this, the scary professor. So the idea is that that whole sense of that the stories we tell our children, how we talk to our children, what we talk to our children about, talk about what's happening in the world, even when they're younger. Even when they're 5 and 6 and 7, ask them their opinions. There's a lot of people using drugs right now. And really hurting themselves. And why do you think that's happening? Why do you think some people are using drugs? And the first reaction may be, well, they're bad people. And then say, well, I don't know if they're bad people, because no person is inherently bad. But what would make a good person do something bad? And you'd be amazed at how much, as a parent, you get amazing insights from 5 and 6-year-olds. They see things. My son asked, I have to throw this out because it's beautiful. I was going through a very difficult divorce at the time when he was 5. And he said to me, I was trying to fake an emotion of being happy with him because I didn't want him to feel sad because mommy was feeling sad. So I get home and he says to me, within a split second, I have a big smile on my face. How are you doing? How was your day? And he looked at me with a very clear voice and said, Mommy, why would you smile when you're feeling sad? No. And just that whole sense of that's such a profound thing to say. Yeah. Why would you fake an emotion that you don't really feel? Yeah. Why would you fake it? Yeah. And in some sense, my daughter asked at 9, she said, when we were talking about gender stereotypes, she said, why do we believe in things that we know aren't true? I'm just telling you, it's not my kids. That's what young people say. Those are the kinds of things young people say. So I'm just saying, listen to your kids, listen to what they teach you, number one. Engage in meaningful conversations with them. Don't think they're too young for it. They're too young for probably the gore, and they don't need to see the gore and the blood and all that kind of stuff. But they're never too young to actually have real conversations about things that matter to you. Get them to reflect on these things. Get them to understand what happens when you're isolated and how people can do bad things even if they're good people, and why they do bad things. And then how do you repair it? How do you deal with the bully? You certainly don't let them bully you. Yeah. But you don't end with simply getting the bully in trouble. The bully should get into trouble. And then there has to be an intervention that talks about how to build friendships in the classroom, how to get kids so that they connect better with each other, not just identifying the one kid who's bullying other kids. Because it's a systemic problem, as you said, Luke.
Yeah. This notion or not notion, this clarity, this insight around being able to look for and to be able to see people's humanity. I think it's such a crucial one, because we are so unfortunately attuned into accepting the story that comes through the news or the gossip or the coffee talk or whatever.
yeah,
And that's this much. It's this much of what you're actually seeing at any given time.
yeah,
And it takes looking for the humanity, looking at the whole of the situation, looking at the whole of the person
yeah,
and the whole of maybe a background
yeah.
that they have been through at any given time for us to start to see a much bigger picture of what's actually unfolding.
Yeah, and also to take
Yeah.
responsibility as a culture. So again,
Yes.
I
That's what I wanted to ask you about before we
yeah,
wrap up.
yeah, yeah. I mean, basically, it's you know, my sister was raped when she was younger. She went through a whole rape trial. It was awful. It's traumatic.
Yeah.
Um, the whole point is that I'm not saying the sort of simple, easy, thin thing of let's take the really awful people and have sympathy for them. I am saying take the awful people, the people who have done violent things in the world to themselves and to other people, and ask the question, the simple question, what happened? Because they weren't born that way. So what happened that made them that way? And if you ask what happened and you don't ask, I don't mean individually, Chuck did this and then Anna did this. I mean, what happened as they were growing up and why is it so pervasive? Why is domestic violence so pervasive? Why is, all these things so pervasive in this country? So what happened as a culture? And that goes back to the whole idea of changing the culture. So the Project for the Advancement of Our Common Humanity was created. It's literally called Project for the Advancement of Our Common Humanity, because the idea is to change a culture, to create a culture that not only is more caring and values caring, but understands how devastating our stereotypes are, our hierarchies are, not just our gender ones, but our race ones, our religious ones, are all sorts of stereotypes. They're all the same stereotype. It's
Yeah.
all the same stereotype. Some people belong on the top and some people belong on the bottom. It's the same
Yeah.
stereotype. It's just different people at the top and different people at the bottom. But the idea is it's the same stereotype. So once you realize that once you put humans into a hierarchy and make some people more human than others, you're going to have problems. So it's to create a more caring culture. But this is where I would push back a little bit on the sort of David Brooks approach, which I obviously support. He's been a big advocate of making a more caring culture.
Mhm.
Is that you also have to make explicit about what gets in the way of caring. Because if you don't talk about you don't have the hard conversation about what gets in the way of caring, you can't make it a more caring culture.
Yeah.
Because telling someone to just care about the person who raped your sister is not very helpful.
Yeah.
It's like, no, excuse me, I don't want to care about someone who did something awful. The
Yeah.
point is that you understand that you have to take responsibility for essentially the way in which you perpetuate this hierarchy of humanness and then change it. And it's easy to change because I've seen it with seventh graders. I've seen it in the NYU classroom. You start naming what the problem is and people immediately, even conservative people in the South, when I'm on the radio station for a conservative radio station, it's amazing that people who are calling in who are really resonating with what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And they know I'm probably politically on the left compared to them, but they totally resonate with what I'm saying about the problem, but also the solution.
Yeah.
They want the same thing. Not everybody, but oftentimes they do.
I think it's just the two points of starting to wrap up is that they care about the same thing because again there's common humanity, and so regardless of political ideologies and everything else that happen to be there, 80 to 90% of the people are usually pretty much on a very, very similar page. If we can have meaningful dialogue and have a conscious connection and be there with each other to actually listen and see where we go.
Yeah.
And I even just the point of you're talking about the increase of caring, but even caring about what's in the way. That's part of what you're describing because we do have a reality, right? Use caring in all the facets.
Absolutely. Oh, Luke, thank you. That was beautifully stated. I'm going to repeat that now in other interviews.
Please.
Care about what gets in the way, because if you don't care about what gets in the way, you can't unblock it, right?
Yeah.
You can't
have to address the reality of it.
Yeah, you can't address the reality of it. So if you don't deal in social emotional learning programs that we have in our schools now, if you don't deal with what gets in the way of connection, you actually can't help connection, because otherwise nobody's talking about the elephant in the room.
Yes.
Yeah.
Niobe, I want to thank you for being here and
Yeah.
spending this time and this passion with us here at One Idea Way. And I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, and very specifically the work that the Project for the Advancement of Our Common Humanity is doing, because it is extraordinary work and work that's very much needed right now.
Thank you so much, Luke. I really had fun.
Thank you. For everybody who's tuned in, I guess one of the pieces that I just want to leave you with is this idea of looking for and seeing the humanity in all the people that are in front of us. It's one of the things that's meant so much to my path is I've gone down the path of studying consciousness and different psychology as well as mindfulness. The more that I've leaned into those things that help me understand myself, and how in that understanding I can see that in other people as well. And I can see how they've arrived at maybe the struggles or the challenges as well as the possibilities that they happen to be facing at any given moment in time. And that is what leads me to feel much more connected to those people around, as well as including to myself. And so I hope that you continue on this journey of connection. I hope you check out the work of the Crisis of Connection, as well as the Project for the Advancement of Our Community, Common Humanity. Please do check those things out. And until next time, as always, continue to enjoy the journey. Check out IPEC's coach training program at ipeccoaching.com/OIA. And of course, to find out about all the conversations, events, gatherings, all the things that we've got upcoming, then head on over to oneideaaway.com/community. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please do us the favor of subscribing, reviewing the show, as well as sharing insights or comments that stood out for you in this episode.